Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. We're looking at the story of a nation that has been written off, conquered, and economically transformed over and over again, yet somehow it always seems to rise from the ashes. Honestly, this matters to all of us. At its core, this is a universal masterclass in human resilience and what it actually takes to preserve your identity when the whole world is trying to erase it.
So, how does a nation actually survive centuries of conquest without losing its soul? Well, to answer that, we've got to look past the myths and dig into the real historical forces at play. We're going to trace the incredible underdog story of Wales. We'll examine its relentless resilience from the days of ancient Celtic tribes living in mountain hill forts all the way to the complexities of modern governance. Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We'll hit 5 distinct eras: early kingdoms and invasions, the Tudor paradox, the industrial powerhouse, reclaiming identity, and finally, devolution and modern Wales. Section 1. Early kingdoms and invasions. Surviving the empires. Think about the sheer relentless waves of external forces crashing against the Welsh borders. Back in 43 CE, the Roman invasion of Britain was absolutely brutal. Our sources show that to subdue the British tribes, the Romans wiped out a staggering 95% of the resistant population. The survivors had to flee into the inhospitable terrain of the Welsh mountains and forests, kicking off a phase of guerrilla warfare that just completely baffled the Romans. Fast forward to 1066. The Normans conquered England rapidly, by hastily throwing up castles. But Wales? Totally different story. The lands of the Welsh princes were vast and largely unfortified. There were no pre-existing works to easily occupy. So conquering this landscape turned into a long, incredibly arduous task for the Anglo-Norman lords. It was a completely different, drawn-out type of frontier warfare.
And the Welsh fiercely resisted this external control. For example, in 1294, a man named Owain ap Glyndŵr sparked a massive national revolt over a relatively petty injustice, a dispute about a serf and his confiscated property. But man, the revolt spread like wildfire. Initially, King Edward I was completely dismissive. He scoffingly wrote that the mountains were just swelling of orisons and showers of prayers, basically mocking the Welsh as just people praying up in the hills. But that arrogance totally cost him. By winter, Edward's own castle at Carnarvon was in grave danger. His forces were deprived of forage, and the king was practically starved into submission, surrounded by dead horses and desperate men in the bitter Welsh winter.
Moving on to Section 2, the Tudor paradox. Welsh pride versus English assimilation. Now, this is a fascinating historical irony that popped up in the late 15th century when a Welshman actually took the English throne. The Tudor era presented a really profound paradox. On one hand, you had this immense Welsh pride. Henry VII, a Welshman, wins the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. And to legitimize his pre-fragile claim to the throne, he brilliantly taps into Welsh iconography. He fights under the Red Dragon of Cadwaladr to fulfill a mythic prophecy. And later, the translation of the Bible into Welsh in 1588 practically saved the language from dying out in the churches. But then on the flip side, we see total English assimilation. Under the Tudors, by 1555, Wales was effectively swallowed up and governed entirely as part of England. English became the absolute exclusive language of law, commerce, and public policy. This created a deep class divide. The wealthy gentry became completely anglicized, adopting English customs and language, while the Welsh language was increasingly marginalized, viewed by the elite as just a dialect of laborers and outlaws.
Section 3. The industrial powerhouse. Coal, steel, and transformation.
Let's transition over to the 18th and 19th centuries. This was an era that fundamentally rewired the nation. Wales shifted dramatically from a region of rural subsistence farming into a heavily urbanized global industrial titan. The mass extraction of coal and iron ore drove unbelievable wealth. Wales went from having these small, isolated villages to facing rapid, explosive urbanization. Entire towns would spring up practically overnight around the new coal pits. And to move this immense weight of coal to the rest of the world, complex, deep-water ports were established in places like Cardiff. But there was a massive cultural cost to all this. The industry demanded labor, which led to a huge influx of English-speaking workers crossing the border. As these complex interdependency networks grew, they heavily diluted the native Welsh-speaking population in these booming urban centers.
65%, let that sink in. In 1913, at the absolute peak of the industrial boom, 65% of all Welsh coal output was exported across the globe. Wales was literally fueling the world. But relying so heavily on just one resource was incredibly dangerous. When global markets later shifted away from coal and towards oil, and following the devastation of World War I, the Welsh economy was left incredibly vulnerable. The resulting crash caused massive, systemic unemployment and a really deep social crisis throughout the coalfields.
And that crisis fundamentally changed the political DNA of the Welsh working class. Take a look at this striking quote from the 1916 funeral of 3 slain Aberdare miners. It vividly captures the intense shift from traditional fealty and loyalty over to a radical fighting idealism. The harsh realities of deindustrialization, the brutal working conditions, and the utter devastation of the First World War just swept away the old political unities. A fierce, new democratic, and often very socialist thought process really began to take hold in the valleys.
Section 4. Reclaiming the Welsh Identity, Language and Defiance. Moving into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we see a dramatic fight to save the Welsh identity from the absolute brink of extinction. Because of the influx of industry, there was rapid, aggressive Anglicization. Just look at the numbers. In just 60 years, the percentage of the population speaking Welsh plummeted from nearly 90% down to around 60%. The language was actively disallowed in many new industrial towns. The age-old culture of the hearth was suddenly being treated by the new English-speaking elite as a quaint, disappearing spectacle. For many native Welsh, it became glaringly obvious that they had a lot to lose and very little to gain in this new industrial society.
But the Welsh pushed back fiercely. They absolutely refused to let their culture be relegated to the history books. Local events became massive flashpoints. For instance, the protests over the lack of Welsh language instruction on Swansea's new tram systems and the intensely defiant Cantrophe Halloween boycott, where local clergy literally forbade attendance at strictly English-speaking schools. These events sparked unadulterated fury, especially from the youth, and the sadistic punishments handed down by school officials for speaking Welsh, that only fueled the fire. This grassroots fight for language rights is really what endowed modern Welsh nationalism with its passion and its purity. Section 5. Devolution and Modern Wales, the Senedd and beyond.
So how did these centuries of cultural resilience ultimately shape actual governance? Well, the return of Welsh autonomy was a very methodical, generational process. Back in the 1970s, we see early, highly constrained proposals for what they called intelligent devolution. This was essentially a Welsh council with zero actual legislative power, totally dependent on Whitehall. But momentum grew. By 1997, a referendum formally established the Welsh Assemble, or the Senedd, though initially it only had limited competence in sectors like health and education. Finally, after proving their capacity to govern, a second referendum in 2011 granted Cardiff fully-fledged, absolute lawmaking powers in all devolved areas. It was a methodical reclaiming of political agency.
And that brings us right to the complexities of the modern era. Looking objectively at the 2016 Brexit vote, it created a highly complex picture for Wales. On one hand, Wales faces a significant challenge: the potential loss of major European regional development funds that had previously poured into infrastructure, plus a possible reduction in international capacity. But on the other hand, the departure presents a unique opportunity to take full ownership of lawmaking in its devolved competencies. This massive shift is actively driving creative, localized efforts to build entirely new economic models and legal regimes customized specifically for Wales, totally free from external frameworks. To wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this final thought. We've seen a nation survive Roman decimation, outlast Norman castles, navigate Tudor assimilation, fuel the industrial world, and fight tooth and nail for its native tongue. After this incredibly resilient journey from ancient tribes all the way to modern parliaments, is Wales, this complex, beautiful, and proudly stubborn nation, finally speaking on its own terms?